And we are live. So a very good afternoon to our delegates in South Africa, and good day, good morning, good evening if you're from around the world. A very good morning to our guest speaker, Richard Yonck from Seattle, Washington, the USA, who's kindly joining us from all the way over there. So Richard, welcome to you. And of course, our very own Johan Steyn, our chairperson of our special interest group in artificial intelligence and robotics. Welcome to you two gentlemen. Welcome to our delegates who are busy joining us. I normally kill a couple of minutes, or at least 60 seconds or so whilst they log in. So thank you for that. I'm sure you all know me by now, but my name is Tony Parry from the Institute of IT Professionals South Africa. And it's my absolute privilege and pleasure to welcome you all to our webinar this afternoon, this evening. As is the norm, I will be handing over to Johan, who's our moderator and question master for this evening, and Richard, his guest, a futurist and author, an international speaker. So we really are very privileged to have Richard with us, and thank you for that, Richard. Right, people are logging in. I just want to remind, we are running out of time for our IITPSA ICT Skills Survey, the annual skills survey, which gives us the great information about skills requirements in South Africa and the world of ICTs. So an appeal to all our delegates, if you haven't yet participated, please do so. When I get a chance a bit later, I'll post the link again in the chat group. So without further ado, Johan, Richard, thank you once again for joining us, and over to you guys.
Tony, thank you so very much. It's so nice when I look on the attendees as people are joining. A lot of people I know, and people doing amazing work, and people showing interest in this topic. Tony, firstly to you and to the team at the IITPSA again, thank you for helping us to host this event. And, you know, like I've said in a talk recently, that I believe the IITPSA is uniquely situated in South Africa for us to work together to affect meaningful change when it comes to the future of our children, the future of our beautiful country with all its problems, using smart technology. Before I introduce Richard, just a little bit of marketing. Our next event is on the 12th of August at 8 a.m. with Dr. Jacques Ludic. He is the CEO of Cortex Logic, and he wrote a book about a month or two ago called Democratizing AI to Benefit Everyone. He's doing amazing work in our local market. So the emails will go out, I'm sure, in a week or two or so, but just keep a little note, 12th of August at 8 a.m. Before I introduce Richard, you know, it's always interesting to see what other notable people are saying about the people we are engaging with, Richard. So if you would indulge me, in researching for this talk, I discovered that Ray Kurzweil, whom I greatly admire, wrote something about one of your books. And, you know, one of the first AI books I ever read by Ray Kurzweil, or by any author really, was The Singularity is Near. And he's also known for books like The Age of Intelligent Machines. Now, just two little facts on Ray Kurzweil. In 1999, he received the Medal of Technology and Innovation from President Clinton. 2002, he was inducted into the National Inventors Hall of Fame. So what a person to write about a book anyone writes about. So in the New York Times book review, he says that Richard Yonck is a sure-footed guide and is not without a sense of humor. And that I can say when I read your books, because it's not just technical blah, blah. It's such a great story you tell. Kurzweil further says that you provide a compelling and thorough history on the interaction between our emotional lives and our technology, and what a great accolade. So all the way from Seattle, where I assume it's around 7 a.m. or so, Richard Yonck, author and futurist, thank you so very much for joining us. How are you keeping?
I am very well. Thank you so much for that amazing introduction, Johan. I really appreciate it. Yes, it's about 8 o'clock here in Seattle, so I'm still getting a little caffeinated. And I'm absolutely delighted to be here with you and your audience to delve a little bit into the nature of human and machine intelligence and what this might mean for our future and the future of our society.
It's a great honor to have you, Richard. Thank you. To all our delegates, and I still see people pouring in, please ask your questions on the chat. We're going to try and leave about 15 or so minutes at the end of this webinar to get to some of your questions, and you are all most welcome. Richard, your book Future Minds, I mean, and as I said to you earlier, I reread it again recently. It's so one thing I think is that artificial intelligence, or the concept, has been there for thousands of years, even though we think it only started in the 60s, which I guess it did. But this world of what is intelligence, and just a bit more about your book, I really wanted to start with that. So people who haven't heard about the book, tell us what it contains and what is the main premise of that book, really.
Absolutely. So Future Minds is my second book about the future of artificial intelligence. But when I approached it, what I really wanted to do was to explore initially where we are going throughout the 21st century in terms of machine intelligence, but also what that means for augmenting human intelligence, and not in some necessarily a direct organic way, but in a way that all technology has augmented us throughout the not just generations, literally the millennia. So in the course of exploring and prepping for this book, what I wanted to do was to look at, as a starting point, what actually is intelligence? What does it entail? What's its origin? And what's the kind of the fundamental nature? Because when we look at and talk about intelligence, I'm just going to start a little presentation here. Not presentation, but when we talk about intelligence, this is something that one of the early pioneers of AI, Marvin Minsky, it's one of the words that he referred to as a suitcase word. And the idea of a suitcase word, whether you're talking about consciousness, intelligence, and what have you, is that it has so many different meanings and definitions for people, depending on who you're speaking to, what topic you're speaking about, and even within a particular field, it has a lot of different meanings. And so it adds not only to confusion, but actually makes it difficult to drill down into it. So in the course of looking at the beginnings of this book, one of the things I did was explore what are the definitions of intelligence. And when you look at that, there are an enormous number. Now, about 15 years ago or so, maybe, Shane Legg and Marcus Hutter, Shane leads DeepMind at Google. They had put together a collection of definitions of intelligence, and they came up with something like 200 separate definitions that they could pull from different literature. And they themselves actually ended up consolidating this into an individual definition. That was a really important it helped define intelligence for me in my first book. But when I came to this book, I kind of delve into it still further. And what I was coming to was that there was actually certain aspects of our universe, the way that thermodynamics and complexity work, that they ultimately lead to pockets, little concentrations of complexity and intelligence, ultimately intelligence, that accumulate in the universe. In our region, it's ended up becoming life on Earth and moving through a range of different forms of that until we reach ourselves, our own species. So in looking at that, what I did was I crafted a definition that intelligence is an emergent system's ability to respond to its environment in order to improve its conditions, perpetuate itself, and maximize its future freedom of action. Now, that last is a really important factor when you look at it in terms of not only our future, but how something can interact with and promote itself in a way that essentially would almost be teleological in terms of having a cause and effect that looks ahead to, but actually what it is when you look retroactively, when you look back, you can see that certain choices, certain events in evolution end up promoting certain structures, organisms, forms of intelligence more than others, and those tend to replicate across. So that future freedom of action actually draws from a particular physicist who utilized it, Alex Wisner-Gross, with regard to some developments of cybernetics that he, I believe, was working with. So I'll stop sharing, but that was the
Okay.
and actually, I didn't actually complete that. Okay, so I don't know that slide was showing. Actually, not a big deal. So anyway, that's in a nutshell. I'll let you take it from there. But I just that's kind of the initial impetus for this book.
On the one hand, what I first want to say is the residential complex I'm living in. There's so many kids running around, Richard, and in Joburg we've had some fairly cold weather, even though you can't compare it to most places on Earth. And the last few days it's warming up. So outside my window, and I don't know if you can hear it on the mic because I've been trying to go on mute, there's so many kids playing. It irritates me, and I love it. And
it's a lovely sound, and it certainly is not distracting me.
Oh, fantastic. Even my own son, and I often speak about him, he's 7 now. And why I'm so drawn to the work that you do and others is I'm, as a parent, constantly thinking about his future and what world am I leaving him. And that also impacts the things I write and speak about. And I think sometimes when we talk about AI and smart technology, it's often a very technical, platform-driven kind of conversation, but it should be a lot more philosophical, which also draws me to your work, because I studied philosophy. And I often say, once I've had my 3rd or 4th scotch, I'm very philosophical. But that kind of leads me to what I want to speak to you about. If we think of, because we speak about intelligence, we can even speak about consciousness. Do you think this kind of technology will develop consciousness and whatever that means? Because that is such a broad topic,
Sure.
Richard, can you still hear me? I think I accidentally turned off your video. I'm so sorry. There we go. Sorry for that.
Can't hear.
No, we can't hear you. Oh, I hope it's not so
I think we're good now. Nope, I think we're good.
There we go. Sorry for that. Thank you.
Begging your pardon. No, what I was starting to say is almost every conversation, almost every presentation that I have, the point of what do these things mean for our future generations, our children, grandchildren, and it's actually, I believe, becoming more and more of a real factor and consideration in this whole equation. This is not just technical matters. This is actually things people are starting to realize just how significantly this impacts and affects our society, and it will only do more so. So we really have to take some pretty active action and choices to be able to ensure that it is the kind of future that we want to live in and that we want to leave for our children and our descendants. So to come back to consciousness, as you were asking, the consciousness is, as we think of it, is completely a human manifestation. When you look at thought pieces, having studied philosophy, I'm sure that you're familiar with, I'm going to blank on the Nagel. Nagel's piece, What Is It Like to Be a Bat? And in that piece, it looks at, speaks about what the differences are in our experience from that of other creatures, other forms of intelligence. And just imagine, we don't have any form of sonar, echolation, and imagine how very different our perception of the world, and therefore our consciousness, would be if we even just overlaid something as relatively simple as that onto our existing experience of the world. Now, extend that still further. All of the biological organisms in our world originate from DNA, RNA. They are all tied at that level. We're looking to create forms of intelligence, forms of tools that are beginning from something extremely different, silicone and so forth. Even when we try to emulate that with various forms of neuromorphic chips, different spiking architectures and so forth, that is still an emulation. It's still an analog, and it's not going to, in my mind, ever achieve the same form. That said, when you get a level of complexity, a level of interaction, continuous communication between like elements, that it eventually reaches a point of leading to kind of a synergistic emergence from those, then yeah, there is a potential there, but I don't think it's a given. And if it does happen, it is not going to be anything like human consciousness. And so I think that's a really important distinction. And it's a distinction whenever I talk about AI and the future of AI more specifically, that I try to emphasize that whatever is happening with these tools that we call intelligence, back to the concept of the suitcase word, that it really isn't the same as our own intelligence, and very likely will continue to be quite different.
I want to touch more on future minds, Richard, and what I would like to tell our delegates. It's such a lovely read, because a lot of these AI and tech books are very technical, and I myself am not actually a very technical person. And in my consulting role, I often think it serves me well, because if I can't get it, my clients won't get it either. I always bring in the really smart machine learning guys later on, or girls. But it's the business understanding that's important, all that. But what I love about your books, and that book in particular, is because you story tell, and it involves AI in the future and all those other things. But it's not just this boring, oh my goodness, why do I have to read this book? It's a fantastic book to read. And you have these, especially, no, really, and I really say that, and I want people to encourage people to read the book, because it's a fun read, and you talk about these characters and their future, and what it would be like to live in the future in this world where, with the cyber physical world, if you would, and all that. But maybe and a question I love asking people, although I would hate it if somebody asks me that, is if I met you in an elevator, in a lift, and we had 3 minutes, and I say, so tell me about your book, how would you answer that question in a few minutes?
Absolutely. Thank you for that, and thank you for all those lovely compliments. It's very much when you're trying to tell a story, trying to find the way to connect with the audience and the readership is, to my mind, critical, and that's just such a nice bit of feedback to have. So thank you for that. So Future Minds, in one sentence, is about the origins and nature of intelligence in our universe, and what that ultimately means for our future, the future of intelligence in our world, both human, biological, machine, and various hybrids thereof, focusing primarily across the 21st century, but certainly because I'd already opened that can of worms, expanding it, even further beyond that. So that's the kind of elevator pitch in a very short nutshell. Since you said 3 minutes, I'll just say that it explores in a somewhat chronological manner, beginning from the Big Bang, looking at various aspects of nature, thermodynamics, the different forces that ended up developing into stars, stellar evolution, and so forth, ultimately leading to the elements that gradually we move through these stages of increasing complexity that become a planet, become an ecosystem, become life. Ultimately, this progresses in an ongoing and very, very consistent manner. And that ultimately leads to various forms of intelligence, including ourselves. So that's that part of the nutshell. I'm happy to talk further, certainly, but there's a whole aspect about the coevolution of human and machine intelligence that I speak about regularly. So I'm happy to talk about that when we're ready.
I will definitely will get to. Before we get to the other book, Richard, Heart of the Machine, I want to ask you a bit about Stuart Brand's pace layering concept. Now, I've never heard of that, but it does sound fascinating. Do you want to touch on that maybe?
I will, and this time I'm going to actually try to share my slide properly. This is a piece that is actually a lot easier to conceive when you see the graphic. So back in a couple decades ago, Stuart Brand, who needs no introduction, he started the Whole Earth catalog, was co-founder of The Long Now, and many, many other adventures and everything else. He conceived an idea called pace layering. And this is the idea that within our world, there are a number of different features that move and change our world at different paces. So what's listed here at the top, the fashion world, is everything from the arts to various forms of creativity and expression, the kind of different aspects of the fringe and counterculture and everything else that changes very, very rapidly in our society. And this brings about change. And as we move through the layers, they tend to move a little less quickly. We move through, it's been structured multiple ways, but in this original, it's structured as fashion on top of commerce, on top of infrastructure, governance, culture, and nature. And so when we look at something like technology that tends to move and change very, very rapidly, what often happens in the course of that is other aspects of our society aren't able to keep up at the same pace. Things like governance, regulation, and so forth, it tends to lag behind. So what ends up happening is you have very frequently, not all the time, a new technology comes along. It begins to make some very rapid changes. There's a kind of a Wild West era going on. And then at some point, there's enough change that there's a reaction within society that the regulators come in and say, okay, we need to do something about this, whether it's, whatever the technology is. And what often happens at that point, partially because of a lack of full understanding of what is going on, is there tends to sometimes be an overregulation that will occur at that point. And then it'll kind of gradually shift back and forth, home in on the right level of regulation that we determine anyway, for that technology as we continue to develop it. But there's a definite time lag that takes place. And what happens as we move through this is, as progress has accelerated, we tend to see more and more significant time shifts between different layers. And when that becomes too great, we tend to see certain kinds of friction in society that lead to different kinds of disruption, different kinds of discord, and so forth. Now, one of the things that Brand said that I think is really interesting about this is the concept that these upper layers, the fast layers, are the layers that learn in our world, that learn in our society, and the lower layers, the slower layers, the culture, the governance, even nature, that these are that slow remembers. So fast learns, slow remembers. And that ultimately, that slower portion is the foundation of our world and our society. It lends stability to our world. And we need both of them. We need to have the innovation and the change and the creativity that we see in some of the upper regions, but we also need that stability that comes with the slower portions of this concept. So that's it in a nutshell. And I can stop sharing that.
No, listen, I'm going to Google the heck out of this because it's so very interesting, Richard.
Thank you.
Before we get to the heart of the machine, your other book, firstly, I want to again encourage our delegates, please ask questions in the chat. And I quickly just want to do a shout out of just some of the names that I recognize from top to bottom. And so Rob Kerridge-Walker, who is an ex-colleague and also heads up one of our special interest groups on quality engineering. Welcome. My good friend Zanzele Ndlovu, who looks after Machine Learning Africa, and we actually do quite a few interesting webinars interviewing people in the local market doing amazing work in this industry. Neville Cousins, who works with the business process enabling South African IITPSA. Fascinating work. I mean, we've had, despite all the nonsense that's happening in our country, Richard, and if you watch the news, you would have seen it. But we recently won some amazing accolades and awards about South Africa being a prime destination for offshore work because of our skills and also the price differentiation, all that. Like Snyman, ex-colleague at Nedbank, him and I would often have a coffee and talk about the philosophy of this technology. And actually, we've always been speaking about a good scotch. We never got to it, Mike, so we definitely need to do it. Lenore Kerringham, ex-UiPath, working in smart automation, intelligent automation, and the rest. Lovely to see you. Lebone Mano, a journalist within the IT space. Nas now, an ex-colleague. So guys, and then there's many others, but there's some of the names I recognize. So really lovely to see all of you here. Richard, let's get back to Heart of the Machine. Now, was that a later book or a prior book to the one we've already discussed?
Certainly, and welcome to everybody. By the way, that's a great list, and I'm really happy to be speaking to all of you and look forward to your questions later. So Heart of the Machine is a, let me just get there here. Heart of the Machine is my first book about artificial intelligence. And what it is I had written numerous articles, Fast Company and others for a few years around what was called at the time affective computing, affective with an A, and this comes out of originally a paper and book that were written by Rosalind Picard at MIT Media Lab in the early 1990s. Now, about mid-90s, 95, Rosalind got her own affective computing department there at MIT Media Lab, and during the course of the next, well, really still going on, but certainly the next decade and more, there was enormous innovation and exploration of the different kinds of devices that could interact with, read, and interpret our human emotions. Now, Since then, the field has expanded. It's sometimes referred to as emotion AI or artificial emotional intelligence. And what it offers is a continuation of the interface development that we have seen over the course of the past 75 years. From the early days of computing, we started with hardwired machines, then moved to punch cards, punch tape, the command line interface. Then the 1980s, we get to GUIs, the graphic user interfaces. And today we've moved into an era of natural user interfaces, the touch screens, the voice recognition, gesture recognition. All of these are ways of interacting with our devices that are becoming ever more natural and easy for us. So back 75 years ago, you needed an advanced degree. You were inventing basically an entire field, and it was only the very trained scientists who were actually able to even program these systems. As we've moved through this era, we are now at a stage where you can take a touchpad, an iPad, hand it to a toddler, and they can start playing with a particular app. That's how significant the impact of this progression of interfaces is, because what it's done is it's abstracted more and more aspects of the computing process away from the lowest levels so that ordinary people can utilize it. Now, what Emotion AI is doing is it's tying into probably one of our most basic and core means of interacting and communicating with each other, and that is our emotions. Emotions originated through our endocrine system. They essentially were there to help us survive, but they also, over time, tended to be externalized in a number of cases, and in a way that became readable to us and became part of how we developed as a social creature, as a social community. So ultimately, that is one way that we communicate, probably communicated a lot prior to true spoken language. And that was something that progressed over the course of actually millions of years. So it's so basic to us that I feel it's a really important means of having our systems be able to interact with us. We can get into it more later, but unfortunately, there are also a range of potential challenges and perhaps vulnerabilities that could come from something like this as well.
Amazing, Richard. And I've just put both links of the books, the Amazon links,
Thank you.
in the chat. I do want to just warn Mike Sneyman, one of our delegates, that I'm going to expect a question of him before we end. And if Tony could help me later to actually, Mike, if you don't mind, to put you on audio to ask, because I know from a philosophical point of view, you'd love it. I want to read a quote from A Future Mind. And again, for me, it shows you how well it's written. And listen to this. It says, "Pretend that you are a peasant or even royalty from a mere 2 centuries ago, and that you were told that in half a dozen generations we would have the ability to see inside people's bodies, to speak with someone on the far side of the world, and to fly to the moon. If we could take a similar leap forward in time, what would we think of the society we found there?" And Richard, when I read that again a few days ago, I remembered I dated a girl who moved to Israel. And the only way we could communicate is either call each other, which was extremely expensive, or we would fax. And I remember the place I worked at, I couldn't wait for that little machine to start churning, and the fax would slowly come through. And it was an amazing technology because I didn't have to write and wait for 2 weeks to later to get there and 2 weeks to come back. And I don't feel that old, although it's ticking on. But even never mind 2 centuries ago, just the fax era. And my dad often told me when he worked for the railways, the local railways organization, and they were one of the first to get fax machine. I think it was in the early 80s at
Mhm.
huge expense. And you actually had to get executive approval to use the machine just from a utilization point of view. And they were standing around this machine, he told me, almost bowing down in reverence, saying, where the hell is technology going, you know? And today, a mere 40 years later, we look at what we've got now. So, I mean, that's why I love that portion of that book. So imagine taking the last 2 centuries, and I think projecting forward, it's not even 2 centuries, it's most likely 10 or so years. Where are we going, in your view? And I think let's touch maybe on the utopian and dystopian part of it, which is a passion of mine to talk about. You know, what would you say?
We're heading in some really interesting and challenging directions. There's no two ways about it. Now, artificial intelligence, since that's I speak about all kinds of different emerging technologies, but I definitely focus a lot on AI because that's so much of what's driving our current world and our future world. And right now we're moving into a period, let's go dystopian for a moment, that is seeing an increase of what I'm calling algorithmic influence, the different ways that our AI is able to create basically feedback loops to interact with and influence our behavior. Now, when I say this, it isn't something that is consciously being done by these machines. They are still operated by people, by human beings, and they are part of an extension of what our drives, our economics are. But we have to recognize just how much immense power we're putting into a few hands in order to do this. The thing with being able to have a two-way communication with each other, with these platforms and ourselves, and I'm speaking right now kind of generally about social media, can create what's often known in computing as an optimization function. This is the idea that a feedback loop can interact back and forth between ourselves and the technology. Now, if we look at what kind of power that has when there is so much immense data, big data, that is able to be mined about ourselves, but also the aggregate that we are a part of. This is immense power and capability, and we really it's one of the areas where we really have to have some very significant ethical questions and discussions around AI. On the other hand, AI continues to become on the nice positive utopic side. AI is continuing over the course of these decades to become more and more embedded in our world, in our society, in our everyday lives. And you mentioned Ray Kurzweil earlier. I think he and certainly others have pointed out that one of the really unique things about AI is as it becomes really good, as it becomes really dependable, it just kind of disappears into the background. Whether we're talking about avoidance systems in automobiles, whether we're talking about fraud detection in credit cards, most people interact with those aspects of our technology today and never give it a second thought that, oh, that was AI that was doing that. And of course, AI is many, many things. It's not one uniform aspect of computing, but it's certainly all falls into a realm that is finding ways to enhance and extend our intelligence and reach within our world.
Richard, I did drop off for a little bit there. I don't know what happened, but I did follow what you were saying. Before we go to some questions, an interesting concept you mentioned is a near future shopping mall. What does that mean? Please tell us about that. It does sound very interesting.
Well, thanks for thinking of that, I actually did what I was just talking about in terms of optimization loops and so forth, actually kind of blends in fairly well here. So as our world becomes filled with more and more sensors, more and more cameras and so forth, what we often refer to as the Internet of Things, there's going to be an opportunity for commerce to utilize this information in a almost continuous manner. Imagine that you have a shopper who is moving through a shopping district, a mall, what have you, wearing augmented reality glasses, something that is really not very far away. It's certainly something that Apple wants to put out there in the next couple of years and start moving away from screens. You know, can go back to Google Glass, and that was a little ahead of its time in terms of where society was and so forth. But here you have an opportunity to have a kind of continual two-way communication between yourself and commerce and the different stores or outlets or what have you. Certainly we're moving these days toward an online kind of interaction for a lot of our purchases, but there's, I think, going to continue to be a certain amount of brick and mortar. So if you're moving through a particular space, perhaps little down the way, 100 feet, a particular store spots you with its on-store camera, ties in with some of the ecosystem that exists, some services, whether they are emotion as a service or some aspect of tying into your social network that perhaps you've given permission to understand or know about some of your preferences, some of your fashion and so forth. But it's also able to analyze, what are you wearing? What's your assumed age and cohort and so forth, and be able to very quickly start making an assessment of who you are. Perhaps send your augmented reality glasses a coupon to try to entice you into their store. Perhaps send you your even a rapidly created avatar of you wearing certain things that are for sale, and basically having a very rapid back and forth that could ultimately draw you in to make the sale. Now, that's potentially something that could be positive for the consumer, but if abused, it also kind of moves into a realm I think of or talk about as predatory marketing, predatory sales, because you have this optimization loop going on, that something that has an enormous amount, potentially an enormous amount of data about you, and ability to process and follow scripts very, very rapidly in order to complete the sale. That's kind of scary stuff. So again, moving a little into the dystopic with something like that. And I'll go ahead and close out that share.
Oh, Mike. Richard, sorry. I think we can already see it just by our mobile phones being tracked. Sometimes when I walk into a shopping mall back in the day, which hasn't happened for a few months now, but you already get a text, SMS message welcoming you because they're geospatially tracking you. So imagine putting smart technology on that. Tony, I wonder if Mike, and again, if you want to, I'd love to bring you on, but I quickly want to do one more shout out to Nomsa Toletsi, who is in Port Elizabeth, who's doing amazing work as a developer around helping young people, especially rural, poor young people, getting into this field of software development and new technology. And I have great respect for people like that because it's a great passion of mine. I always say, as a South African, despite all the stuff, what an incredible country to live. But if we cannot use this technology to make life better, what are we doing? So I don't know, Mike, and again, you don't have to, but I'd love to hear your question. If it's possible, I think Tony might have sent you an invite on Webinar Jam to go on to audio. And while we're waiting, we'll just see if there's any chats in the chat box. While we're waiting, Richard, what is the next book we can look forward to? Anything in brewing?
Oh, yes. I've got a couple of things brewing. I don't have a full title yet. I'm exploring a couple of different areas. One certainly around the nature of the different technologies that are altering our behaviors in more and more directed ways, and what that potentially could mean. But also I want to explore on a more positive note the people who are actually building our future, the individuals and the kind of fields that are rapidly, but not that well known right now, moving ahead to change the kind of future that, and hopefully for the better, that we're building.
And when can we expect that book? Although I know that's sometimes a difficult question.
It can be a little difficult. There's a lot of different factors that go into that, but I'll speak to my publisher and get back to you.
Okay, certainly. I want to quickly check. Mike Snyman, are you on? And somebody did pop up onto the screen.
He's joined us.
Can
you hear me?
There we go, Mike. Hello. So I'm sorry for putting you on the spot. We were colleagues, and I feel no shame about this. So I know you've got some interesting questions always to ask somebody like Richard.
Hi, Mike.
Cool. So, Johan, I don't know how well my sound is.
That's okay.
We've got it.
Okay, cool. How's it, man?
We're good. What do you want to ask? And it's lovely to well, not see you, to hear you, Mike. But I know, listen, we were always scratching our heads about the philosophy of this stuff. So I'd love to hear if you have any interesting questions for Richard.
Yeah, there's a big echo, Johan, so I'm just going to talk, and I hope the message gets through.
Hear you great.
Okay.
And I think one of the things...
Go on, Mike.
It's such an echo. Okay, I'm going to go for it because there's an echo. Let's go. So I think the biggest thing for a father nowadays is to kind of think, how do I prepare my family and my kids for this new world? And I think if you read some of the books, especially old Bostrom's books, he's got quite a dark view of what the future is bringing to us, the whole idea of singularity. And once we reach that, what is it going to mean for us? So I think, and I don't know if it's an easy question or a very complicated question, but how do you prepare for it? I think if you look at what Musk is doing around the neural interface, I think that's his way of trying to cope with it, to be able to actually have a fast, high volume network into some kind of machine to augment human beings. Or is it just a question of trying to keep up with technology and making sure all your kids have got PhDs in computer science? How do you prepare for this world?
Fantastic question, Mike. It's something that I explore with audiences and with clients frequently. And really, it's, first of all, as a starting point, Bostrom's book, and the singularity is near, actually, is kind of the reverse side of that. They're almost, one's very much a dystopic view, one's very much a utopic view. And both of them, though, are looking ahead to a level of AI that really seems to become having enough of its drives and motivations advance to the point that they become highly threatening to us. But they also tend to emulate and think very much in human terms when we some aspects. Bostrom's work actually tries to move away from that a lot, but it still comes down to an idea that we're going to see these devices, these technologies advance so rapidly. And I think that's a little, for lack of a better word, optimistic, to think that middle of the century, we're going to see that level of AI. We are going to see some really significant changes and developments in that time frame, but I think we're still going to very much be in the driver's seat during that time. So what I believe, need to be doing is be looking to controlling and regulating the human side of that equation, the people who are making those decisions, the people who are utilizing the technologies, and also creating the technologies in a way that kind of factors in the idea that there are people out there that don't necessarily have our best interests at heart. So we've got everything from what's going to happen as AI becomes more and more prevalent in cybercrime, what is going to happen as it essentially becomes more and more embedded in the marketplace, in commerce. How do we want to see that world develop? And we really still have the level of control. We're not going to see AI, I don't believe, become autonomous to the point where it is a self-directed threat to us. The threat still will be human-driven. So I think that's a really important factor. To touch on your point about how certain people are responding, such as Musk and others with ideas like Neuralink and kernel and other approaches to BCIs. The idea of a BCI is phenomenal. The DARPA began some early work on that, kind of launched things along in the early 1980s, I believe it was. And we've since got to the point here in recent years, last decade, where our computing power and our sensing capabilities have become so advanced that we can now allow people to use it for generating speech, use it for controlling wheelchairs, what have you. And I think that for a long time, we're going to see that things like that used for therapeutic purposes. Once you get to the question of using something like that electively, you get into some really significant ethical issues. And so everything from the organics of putting something physically inside someone's head to you're interacting with and working with people's thoughts, no matter how fine or what the granularity is, how fine-tuned that is or not. Another thing about Neuralink I'm going to just mention is it's a great idea. I love the overall concept that we are moving toward a BCI. While I believe that there's going to be regulation and societal resistance to things like this, many aspects of the technology excite me. But we actually, the idea of offloading certain resources, certain requests, like using our iPhones, really, that I want to do a quick search. I want to get some information that maybe I utilize a little bit of cloud computing, server time or what have you. That's great. It's basically simple instructions and simple, information flow. But there has been shown to be a limit in terms of the rate that the human brain takes in information. And it's actually a fairly defined, the number that's come out in some early studies was 41 bits per second, which is really low when we think of it in computing terms. But actually that is probably, there's a lot of different types of compression, but there's also a range of different human cognitive biases that come into play that kind of make that possible and allow us to take in information that seems like it's in excess of that. But when you actually compare it to a recent study about the rates that all human languages communicate at, almost all of them max out at about 39 bits per second. So here you have a kind of a corroboration of this idea that we have a kind of a threshold. So if you think about, I'm going to start throwing megabytes at a person's brain, we might worry that there's going to be some serious organic or psychological damage that could happen with something like that. So I think there's a whole lot we are going to be discovering and learning in the course of this over the coming decades.
Thank you so much, Mike, and also Richard. Our time is up, but if you still have a few more minutes, Richard, there's two questions I briefly want us to touch on. One from Neville and one from Prof. Margaret, and then I'll hand it back to Tony just to close it off. When I think of Seattle, I think of Dr. Crane.
Fraser,
and
yes.
Fraser and Niles. Niles is my favorite. I love that show, and the amount of times I've illegally downloaded it and watched it over and over again is astounding. I hope this is not being recorded. I'm just saying, but Neville's question is quite relevant. If you think of South Africa, I mean, a developing economy, all the stuff that's happening, we think of Fraser Crane, and we think of Seattle, and we think of how developed a lot of areas in the West, in the US and other places are. So Neville's question is, what does a country like South Africa need to do to ensure that we embrace AI and don't lag behind? What future skills do we need to be developing? And I want to ask you for 3 minutes on that, and we do 3 minutes on the next question. It's a horrible ask, I know, but please.
No, I'm happy to riff. Very first little quick response. No one with Fraser Crane's income would have been able to afford that apartment. It's actually been looked at by multiple people for different articles. So it might be a little bit of a fictional exaggeration. So to come back to the more the question itself, how do we ensure that we are, any of us, any of our cultures, any of our countries are keeping up? And I think that ultimately, this really comes down to access to education throughout not just our formative years, but really our lives. And we are moving into an era of more and more rapid change, more and more transformation of different aspects of our society. And because of that, jobs are going to move, change, go away in differing fields at differing points, and there's going to need to be a lot of regular retraining, a different attitude toward lifelong learning that becomes essentially embedded in our culture. Now, in order to do that, certainly, I don't know, I'm suspecting that South Africa doesn't have quite the level of expense. It's gotten really crazy for higher level learning in the US, and I'm hopeful that in order to do that, one of the things that's going to happen is not only structural changes to continuing learning, but also various changes to the economics of it, so that the businesses are going to be benefiting by the retraining, but they're also going to be benefiting by maintaining certain types of loyalty and not having to re-onboard and search for new people every time that there are changes and shifts in the world. So I think that having a path to really transforming our education systems everywhere, in order to recognize that people are going to be learning new skills throughout their lives. And in the course of that, you've got people who are going to become programmers, people who are going to be working more and more in conjunction with different forms of AI. The term, I'm sure that some of your listeners are familiar with, is cobots, the idea of working with a robotic coworker that you actually are perhaps almost at a colleague level. And again, here is a point where something like emotion AI can help to not only make that an easier communication and interaction between the devices and ourselves, but also protect the workers. So that's hopefully a 3-minute response.
Thanks. And it's, again, education is such a massive topic for us in our country, Richard. We're going to have to do another session with you if you would have us.
I'd be delighted.
I want to quickly, before I again end off and hand over to Tony, just briefly, Prof. Margaret Cullen from the Nelson Mandela University asks a very brief but very poignant question, your view on digital twins. And again, 3 minutes if you could.
Digital twins, I get into it a lot in Future Minds, as you may remember from a couple of chapters. But the term, again, almost a suitcase term, means a lot of things at this point. So digital twinning is the concept of creating virtual representations of different aspects of our world, including ourselves potentially, in silico, in a virtual sense. And this allows us to do various kinds of modeling, various kinds of interaction, and so forth. So it's a little open-ended as a question, but I'm going to take it that you're thinking a little bit along lines of human digital twinning, and I think it's actually quite it's rife with potential issues and conflict, but I think it also could really enable an enormous amount of new capabilities for ourselves. So as a simple current idea, there's this probably amounts to being a plug, but I'll give it for her anyway. There's a European artist, musician, composer, Holly Herndon, who has just created a digital twin platform wherein she does a lot of interesting work with music, working with GANs, generative adversarial networks, and working with different aspects of AI to create music, to create imagery, and so forth. And her what she's done is created a platform, just released it, that allows users to upload their own songs, their own music, and have it transformed into her voice, her essentially avatar, and so forth. And then a certain group that amounts to what she's calling a DAO, but a group of curators essentially kind of vote and say, okay, this is in keeping with her kind of style and image and so forth, or it's not. And if it's allowed, then using NFTs and blockchain, they are able to have a degree of profit sharing and so forth, all through this idea of a digital twin, use of the digital twin for an artist, which really, is pretty cool in terms of what that could mean for enabling some serious changes in the economic structure in fields that are traditionally, a lot of artists and musicians don't get treated well necessarily. So that's hopefully addresses a couple points, but that's a huge topic and almost suitable to our next conversation, Johan.
Thank you, Richard. Tony, just before I hand over to you, Richard, I think the IITPSA is, and I've said this lately again, uniquely situated to affect change, to use and debating and thinking and use smart technology to affect the future of our children in our beautiful country. Once the world gets back to non-crazy, it would be lovely if you could visit us one day. It's such a beautiful country. We're so proud of it, Richard.
I would love to.
Yeah, and it's been a singular honor to have you. And thank you for a lovely, lovely session and for sharing what you've shared with us. Thank you for your time.
Thank you so much for inviting me. It's been an absolute pleasure. I've really enjoyed this. And yes, likewise, I would love to, at some point, whether you're visiting Seattle or I'm visiting South Africa, Tony, Johan, we'll share a scotch, and it'll be a nice opportunity to philosophize about a lot of things.
Fantastic, Richard. Thank you. Tony, thank you.
Yeah, you probably heard the yes. I couldn't resist visiting Seattle. What a beautiful city. I was saying offline earlier. And Richard, thank you so much for joining us early-ish in the morning from Seattle, Washington, USA. Johan, yourself, as always, sublimely handled, and the hour went so quickly. I turned around and looked and think, boy, where are we? Just a note before we close off. There is a question on the chat from Abhijit Nath. It's a very long question. What I'd like to say to him is I'm going to actually, I've copied it. I'm actually going to send it through to Richard and Johan, and maybe we can just have a look at it. It might even lead off from a future conversation. Sounds very interesting, a bit out of my league, but it looks great. Richard, thank you. It's been awesome. It's been a real privilege and a real pleasure to have you with us. Thank you so much for joining us from the USA, as I've said. Johan, chairperson of our special interest group in artificial intelligence and robotics, thank you again. Thank you to Prof. Cullen, to Neville Cousins and others for their questions on the chat. Thanks to everyone for joining. As Johan said, we've got more webinars coming up, so please watch the social media, watch the website, the newsletter should be coming out tomorrow, the monthly newsletter. So all those things will keep people in check. Richard, we look forward to engaging with you again. Have a good day.
Pleasure.
We're about to hang up the whatever, boxing gloves, shoes, whatever it is that we take off at this time of the evening. But to yourself, have a good day further. To our delegates, stay safe, stay warm, look after yourselves, and we'll catch you on the next one. Cheers to
Thank you all.
Thanks, everyone. Thank
Bye
you,
now.
Richard. Go well, guys.
Take care.
Bye-bye. Bye.